We often become fixated on the surface of things at the cost of the meaning of things. This is a story from the Western Isles of Scotland, although I think it may have roots in Ireland. There's a beautiful version of it in David Campbell's book Out of the Mouth of the Morning, and it's from David that I first heard this story. It's the story of Dair and Lugna. Now Dair loved the island. It was the island of her birth. It was the island of her heart. And on this day, as on many other days, she sat in that place that she loved. Grassy slope below the Croft house that she shared with her family. And as she sat there on that hot, dry summer afternoon, she gazed out across the bay, which looked to her like a blue, green, grey meadow. And she could see the silver glint of the sun glistening on the crests of the waves across the bay. And she could see patches of darker water. Those were the deeper places. And a boat was making its way to shore. And it was rowed by Lugna, the hunchback. And he was bringing his day's catch back to shore. And as Lugna struggled to haul his boat ashore, Dair could hear the crunch and the scrape of the shingle on the underside of the boat. And she could also hear the laughter and the shouts of the children of the island as they poured down onto the beach. And those children threw stones at Lugna, and they mocked him, and they jeered, and they laughed at him, for they feared Lugna the hunchback. And Lugna turned his face away from the children as he struggled to lift his catch onto his shoulder. And as Lugna hirpled along the beach with his catch balanced awkwardly on the hunch of his back, and the children jeering and laughing and throwing their stones, Dair was moved to pity. She had been to the well and she had a pail of water, so she ran down onto the beach and she lifted a cup of water to Lugna's lips, and he drank deep of that cool water. Then he lifted those dark, sad, lonely eyes of his, and he looked upon Dair's face with gratitude, and he never forgot that small act of kindness. Now when winter came, it was a harsh winter, a wet winter, and there were gales that blew across the island. And then the earth froze hard, and it stayed frozen hard well into spring. And when spring gave way to summer, the summer was also harsh. It was dry and it was hot, and the winds continued to blow across the island so that the crops were ruined. And when winter came, it was again a harsh winter. And without food, the islanders went hungry, and many died. But under cover of darkness, every so often, Lugna would make his way to the croft door of where Dair and her family lived, and he would leave dried fish and oats that he had stored up and peats for the fire, and in this way Dair and her family survived that harsh winter and made it through to the springtime. And one spring morning, Dair's father was walking on the shingle beach, and he chanced upon Lugna, who was preparing his boat for the day. And Dair's father said, "Lugna, I know it was you who left dried fish and oats and peats by our croft door. And it is thanks to you, Lugna, that my family survived the winter. How can I repay you?" But Lugna turned away, shamefaced. But Dair's father, who was a kind man, laid his hand on Lugna's shoulder and he said, "Lugna, I owe you the lives of my wife and my children. How can I repay you?" And again Lugna looked up with those dark, sad, lonely eyes, and he said, "There is but one thing that my heart desires. I would marry your daughter, Dair, for I love her." And when Dair's father spoke to her about this, she said, "No, no, 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 no. I could never love such a man. I could never love such a man. I can scarce look upon him." But Dair's father spoke to her of the debt that they owed Lugna. They owed him their lives. So Dair agreed to marry Lugna. And they were married in the small white chapel by the shore. Now Dair cared for Lugna. She made and sewed his clothes. She cooked for him. She kept his house. And Lugna worked hard, fishing every day, because he loved Dair and he wanted the best for her. But he knew in his heart that she could not love him. And this made his sadness even more painful to bear. The island was no longer a happy place for Dair. And the place that she loved was now empty to her. And as she sat there, gazing out over the bay, it seemed a dull grey to her now. And the larks, which had once danced and circled in the air above her, singing beautiful melodies that reminded her of the melodies that the old people sang around the fires in the winter time, they were gone now. And in their place circled the gulls, which seemed to mock Dair in her unhappiness. As she looked out over the bay, she saw Lugna's boat coming for shore, and in the prow of that boat stood a man, and he seemed to glow, for this was Columcille, and the people of the island knew that Columcille was a saintly man, a man who had given his life to God, a man who had submitted his will to the will of God. And when the boat was brought ashore, Columcille made his way straight to the croft house that Dair shared with Lugna. And he took Dair's hands, her soft hands, in his strong, gnarled hands. And he looked at her and he said, "You are the wife of Lugna. He spoke of you on the boat." And Dair said, "Yes, this is true. I am the wife of Lugna, and I care for him, and I sew and I mend, and I make his clothes, and I cook his meals, and I keep his house, and he looks after me. But in my heart I cannot love Lugna. You are Colm Cille. You must know of the island where the women who give themselves to God live. The women who never marry. I would rather be on that island with them." Colm Cille looked at Dair and he said, "Do you believe that all things are possible for God?" And Dair said, "Yes, I do. I do believe that. So would you go this night and pray that God bring love where love is not?" I will do that, Colm Cille," said Dair. But in her heart, she did not believe that this was possible. Well, that night, Lugna went to the small chapel by the shore, and on his knees he prayed all night long. And Colm Cille walked to Shingle Beach and prayed. And Dair sat by the window of the croft and gazed out into the night, which was a wild night. And as she watched the wind blow the black clouds across the moon and shake the trees that surrounded the croft, she became tormented. And all night she was tormented. She tried to pray, but she could not, until at last she grabbed her shawl and she wrapped it around her shoulders and she ran out into the night. And at that moment, a gust of wind blew the black clouds away from the moon, and the moon shone its light down, and it cast the shadow of a hawthorn tree over Dair. And it took on the form of a savage beast. Dair shrunk back against the croft wall, for she felt the savage beast had come to devour her loveless heart. Then she felt a tender touch on her shoulder. And she lifted her gaze. There stood Lugna, with his dark, sad, lonely eyes brimming with love for Dair. And in that moment, she recalled that day on the beach where she had lifted cool water to Lugna's lips, and the gratitude in his eyes. And she threw her arms around Lugna's neck, and she felt his great strength, and she also felt his trembling vulnerability. Lugna, you are a good man. Come into the croft where I shall warm you. When the sun rose out of the mouth of the morning, Colm Cille approached the croft house and entered the croft house to see Lugna and Dair sitting by the fire. and they ate breakfast together. And then Lugna went to prepare his boat. And Columcille turned to Dair, and he said to her, "Would you still travel to the island of the women who give themselves to God?" "I would not," said Dair. "My place is here on this island which I love, with my husband Lugna." Dair walked down to that place which she loved, and she stood there, and she watched as Lugna rowed with his strong arms out into the bay, with Columcille standing in the prow of his boat. And to Dair's eye, there were now 2 points of light glowing from that